Welcome to the Explainer. Let's just jump right in today because we are unpacking something that completely redefines how we work, lead, and frankly, exist in complex systems. We're pulling straight from Chapter 7 of the book Conscious Leadership, and we are taking a really deep look at autonomy. But look, I need you to just set aside your usual definitions for a minute. We're not talking about working from home or picking your own hours or getting rid of managers. No, we're talking about a profound evolution of human consciousness. So think about this question for a second. When consequence escapes structural containment, what governs our actions? It's a pretty provocative hook, right? I mean, in our hyper-connected world, the effects of what we do travel so much faster and further than ever before. We really have to shatter this illusion that standard org charts or external bosses are going to somehow keep us safe. When the system is moving way too fast for the hierarchy to catch the fallout of your decisions, what exactly is guiding you? Well, let's clear up a massive misconception right out of the gate. There is a huge gap between the popular myth of autonomy and the actual demanding truth. The myth basically tells us that autonomy is just independence, freedom from constraint, just being left alone to do your thing. But the truth? The reality outlined in our source text is that autonomy is the capacity to govern action from within and actually carry the consequence of that action. It's a deeply internal regulatory capacity. It's not just some external permission slip you get from HR. There's a brilliant quote from the text that hits the nail on the head. Systematic order requires more than permission to act. It requires the maturation of judgment capable of carrying obligation within action. You can literally rewrite an org chart to decentralize power all day long. Authority can absolutely be delegated structurally, but true autonomy, that requires a deeply internalized psychological responsibility. Without that maturation, you aren't empowering anyone. Actually, you're just distributing chaos. Okay, moving to Section 1, the trap of compliance, the shadow of heteronomy. So what is heteronomy? Well, when the human mind lacks genuine autonomy, it leans entirely on the structures around it. Heteronomy is literally the opposite of autonomy. It's action regulated by external forces, things like authority, habit, convention, or, let's be honest, fear. It substitutes real, organic coherence for mere compliance. And it's the default state for so many people at work. You do things because a boss, a manual, or just the fear of getting fired tells you to. Your moral compass is completely outsourced to the system. Which forces us to ask a pretty terrifying question. What actually happens when we surrender our judgment to authority, when we rely totally on heteronomy to guide what we do? We don't really have to guess here. History and science have already given us the answer, and it's a stark warning. Unconscious compliance is this reflexive adherence to rules without any active reflection or comprehension. The text points to the famous Stanley Milgram experiments to show just how vulnerable we are to this. When structure substitutes for your own situational awareness, obedience completely replaces discernment. People will literally allow massive systemic failures just because they assume the hierarchy is absorbing the responsibility. The whole system becomes incredibly brittle. Let's look at how this plays out day to day. The text outlines these specific systemic failure mechanisms. First, responsibility gets externalized to procedure. You hear things like, hey, I just followed the manual. Second, authority is projected onto hierarchy. Well, it's the boss's call, not mine. Third, judgment is replaced by convention. We've always done it this way. And finally, action is gated by approval. I'm just waiting for sign-off. These aren't just excuses. They're psychological defense mechanisms that actively prevent individuals from stepping up and using the judgment that real autonomy demands. All right, Section 2, the genesis of autonomy, the ascent of maturation. To really grasp how we move from that blind compliance to true self-authored wholeness, let's look at Jean Piaget's developmental framework. He mapped out how our moral judgment actually develops. Step 1 is obedience. This is pure external constraint, following rules just because an authority figure said so. Step 2 is reciprocity. This is where you cooperate with peers, negotiate rules, and focus on fairness. But the real breakthrough is Step 3, self-legislation. This is where justice and principles are fully internalized. It's no longer about external force. It's an active, reflective choice driven by your own conscience. And here is the real kicker. Autonomy is not an automatic consequence of age. It is a hard-won developmental achievement. Just because you're a biological adult does not mean you are psychologically autonomous. Lots of professionals are completely stuck in heteronomous patterns. They treat workplace procedures like sacred, unbendable laws, rather than taking responsibility for their own judgment when complex situations change. Which brings us to Section 3, maturing the human mind beyond independence. Since breaking free from your boss isn't the actual finish line, we need to trace this through Robert Kegan's framework of maturation. We start with the socialized mind, pure conformity to the group. Then we evolve into the self-authored mind. This is cognitive independence. You generate your own values, you act from your own convictions. But as the source points out, even that isn't quite enough for true systemic wholeness. You have to reach the self-transforming mind. This is where you move past just asserting your ego and you actually begin to resonate and align with a deeper systemic order. See, egoic independence is what we usually think autonomy is. It's freedom unmoored. It's just you asserting your will over everything else, which honestly just reproduces domination internally. The real goal is deep resonance. This is the profound reality of aligning with the living intelligence of life. It's when you participate consciously in the moral gravity of your own becoming. You're not just some disconnected rogue agent. You are deeply, consciously connected to the whole. Now for Section 4, the burden of consequence, the inner summons. When we make decisions in these incredibly complex modern networks, we are facing a really heavy reality. The text defines a summons as the pre-deliberative apprehension of moral law as binding, experienced as an unavoidable obligation. Now, what does that actually mean? It means it's a gut-level lived recognition. You just know you're implicated by what you see and do way before anyone hands you a formal rule. It's that feeling deep down that says, I see the consequence of this and therefore I own it. I absolutely love this quote from the text. Information does not become meaningful merely by being processed. It becomes meaningful when it is experienced as calling for response. We have machines that process information. We are drowning in data. But in a world of abundant awareness, human consciousness is what must feel the moral weight of a decision. A data point is just a signal, but a summons, that actually binds you to act. And that brings us to this foundational rule. Responsibility must move with action. As our networked world speeds up and decision-making gets pushed further and further out to the edges of our organizations, the burden of consequence simply cannot be deferred upward on an org chart. It has to be carried internally by the person taking the action. If you demand the autonomy to act, you must have the developmental maturity to carry the consequence. No exceptions. Finally, Section 5, Resonance and Wholeness, the climax of autonomy. This is the exact point where the psychological maturity of the human mind perfectly meets the operational needs of a complex world. Autonomy is not isolation. It is the capacity to apprehend the implicate order and render it explicate through conduct. Think about that. Autonomy isn't about separating yourself, going rogue, or just doing whatever you feel like. It's about acting as a finely tuned receptor for the coherence of the whole system and expressing that order through the things you do every single day. The book gives us this incredible metaphor of the autonomous musician. A master musician doesn't get to be a master by rejecting the structure of music. No, they internalize that structure so deeply that their expression becomes totally effortless. They don't fight constraint, they absorb it, until the regulation is entirely endogenous. It comes from within. Their playing is perfectly constrained by the laws of music, and yet, at the exact same time, it is beautifully, totally free. That is what true autonomy looks like. Ultimately, it boils down to this. Constraint is no longer imposed from without, it is carried from within. This is the massive shift we've been talking about today. The responsibility moves away from an external rulebook, a manager, or a compliance department, and shifts directly into your own unshakable internal compass. Once you achieve this, you don't even need to be managed anymore, because you are governing yourself in total alignment with the whole. So I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. Are you merely complying with external systems, or have you genuinely cultivated the inner judgment to carry obligation within your actions? I really want you to think about that today. Are you just following a script handed to you, or are you actually on the developmental journey toward true, conscious autonomy? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I hope this totally shifts how you see your own capacity to lead and act going forward.